thank you to Provost Houlihan and to Rob Oliva and to Brother Bill and to all of you students and faculty who came out today to hear a little bit about Irish history. Let me start by saying Banachdi le Féile Frág Jeev, which is blessings of the Feast of St. Patrick upon you. When we think of Irish immigration, what comes to mind first of all are those 1.5 million people displaced by the potato famine who fled to England, America, Canada, and Australia in search of a livelihood they could not make. The people who left Ireland at the time of the famine left behind a devastated rural economy and some million dead due to a blighted crop and the inexorable march of the free market, which required grain to be exported abroad. But there was an earlier Irish diaspora to Europe that occurred just after the 9 Years' War. Let me start again. How many people here are either immigrants or children or grandchildren of immigrants? Yeah, right, okay. Well, this is what I'm going to be talking about today, about Irish people who immigrated from Ireland, not to the US, but to Europe, and in particular, those who landed in Rome, and what that had to do with the formation of Irish culture before there was even an Irish nation. Because you all know, right, before 1916, before the rebellion, before the Civil War, before the formation of the Irish Republic, for years Ireland was under the domination of the English. So when we think of Irish immigration, what first comes to mind is the people who emigrated at the time of the potato famine. And this was a huge emigration of over 1.5 million people, and behind they left another 1 million dead from the famine. But there was an earlier Irish diaspora to Europe that occurred in the late 16th, early 17th century. At the close of something referred to as the 9 Years' War, which was the last great united effort of the Irish in the 16th century to overthrow rule by England. And this exodus of the defeated Gaelic Lord Hugh O'Neill and his entourage of some 150 people is referred to in English as the flight of the Earls. This would be the immigration of an elite group. In 1607, the defeated Hugh O'Neill left Ireland in an attempt to get to Spain in order to seek aid for a military re-entry into Ireland. But despite the repeated letters that he wrote to the Spanish king, the Pope, colluding with Spain, never allowed O'Neill out of Rome. He never made it to Spain. He ended up in Rome. And so he died there, a broken and frustrated man, in 1615. His leaving Ireland was in contravention of the law, and as a consequence, the English crown confiscated his lands and created out of them the plantation of Ulster in 1609. Now, my talk today grows out of a larger project on the Irish in Rome, which begins with the arrivals of the Northern Earls there in 1608. And an Irish Franciscan friend of mine in Rome once said to me that Irish spirituality is a spirituality of place, in contrast to the Roman spirituality, which is a spirituality of personality. Think of the ruined medieval monasteries and the naturally beautiful holy spots of pilgrimage in Ireland, and contrast that with the great Baroque frescoes and statues of Rome, and I think you have some idea of what I'm talking about. But when they came to Rome, the Irish had to make a place for themselves there. And in the process of making a place for themselves in Rome, the Irish were coming to terms with their place in the world, because Rome was really the center of a huge empire all over the world. You know, from 1580 to 1640, the world encompassed many places where you could find a mass being said at any time of the day. This was because of the rule of the Spanish monarchy, the most Catholic monarchy, exploring the world and including the world in this global Catholic culture. And Rome was the center of that. In Rome, the Irish rubbed shoulders with people from every nation around the world. Rome was the juggernaut of the Counter-Reformation. Roman institutions sent out missionaries to all parts of the globe and attracted others from all parts of the globe back to the city. And in adapting to their adopted home, the Irish also created new representations of themselves on the public international stage of the papal city. They created new texts, monuments, and institutions in Rome, and these in turn had an impact over the centuries on those people back in Ireland. These Irish exiles, in coming to think about their place in Rome and in the larger world, developed a new sense of themselves as a nation. They created books, visual culture, catechisms, grammars that were no less than the creation of a national culture in exile. The larger question I want to ask is, how did being in Rome influence the way these Irish exiles represented themselves to the world? As the president of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, has noted, given that no people can fully define itself from within, exile is indeed the cradle of nationality. One could add that the construction of nationality becomes a strategy of survival for exile communities. The representation of this imagined nationality displays accommodation to and intervention in Roman and Irish power struggles, as well as care for the relatively powerless mass of people back at home in Ireland. So I've chosen to speak about three innovative representations of Irish culture in Rome. And first, I'll talk about the public appearance of Hugh O'Neill in spring of 1608, as recounted in the first travel narrative in the Irish language. And then I'll speak about St. Isidore, St. Isidore's, the first Irish-Roman college, Franciscan college, founded by Luke Wadding in 1625. And finally, I'll also briefly consider Francis O'Malloy's Grammar of the Irish Language, the first Irish grammar ever printed, issued by the Press of Propaganda Fide in 1677. O'Neill's entry in Rome in 1608 is recounted in the first travel narrative in the Irish language by Taig O'Cianon. This text, written in Rome in 1609, has an adventurous and optimistic spirit that contrasts sharply with the English language title for the text, The Flight of the Earls. As portrayed by O'Cianon, this exodus of Hugh O'Neill was neither merely an escape from arrest, nor was it voluntary exile. The first Irish language title given to the manuscript text in an inventory at St. Anthony's College, Louvain, is Turas na Nearly, which could be translated as the tour or the pilgrimage of the Earls. In fact, the text can be considered a public relations exercise designed to buoy up the spirits of its readers, the Irish-speaking Irish exile community, both aristocrats in Rome and Franciscan students in Louvain, in the Low Countries. Now, at the top of every page of the manuscript, you can see that Jesus symbol. I don't know if you can see it. With the cross, that's the symbol, you know, the Jesuits stole from the Franciscans. The Jesus symbol, what we know from St. Bernardino. This symbol identifies the text with its Franciscan readership. In presenting O'Neill as a success in Rome, the text builds an optimistic view of possible support for the exile Irish, both from the Spanish king and from the Pope. We know in hindsight that this didn't occur, although O'Neill's plan for a Spanish-supported re-entry into Ireland was ultimately never fulfilled. While in Rome until his death, he seized every opportunity to support the cause. And Tycho Keenan's travel narrative, the first of its kind in the Irish language, reflects the aspirations of the trip as a way to gain influence with both Spain and the Pope through being present at the center of Catholic power in Rome. Now, while the author, O'Keenan, never directly explains why O'Neill left Ireland and went to Rome, he does narrate O'Neill's arrival there as a momentous event in European politics. The text dazzles the reader with the marvels of unusual places and haunting stories. As Cardinal O'Fee commented, he wrote like an Irish country lad seeing the Taj Mahal for the first time. But this text is much more than a travel narrative, and O'Keenan is much more than a country lad. One of the most celebrated public appearances of O'Neill that he describes is his participation in the Corpus Christi procession with the Pope himself. This is no naive account, but one well aware of the power, or even simply the appearance of power, that proximity to the Pope could create. After a journey of some 6 months and 3 weeks from Rathmelton on Lough Swilly in County Donegal, the lords of Tyrone, Tyrconnell, and Fermanagh arrived in Rome. Archbishop of Armagh, Peter Lombard, met them at the Ponte Milvio on Tuesday, April 28, 1608. O'Keenan recounts how they were outfitted with 15 coaches, all but a few drawn by 6 steeds, all gifts from the Cardinal of Rome. And from the Ponte Milvio, they went to St. Peter's, where they made the traditional pilgrimage to the 7 churches of Rome, here laid out on a map from the Jubilee year of 1600. And just later, days later, on May 4th, the Pope granted them a private audience at the Palazzo Quirinale. This impressive portrait of O'Neill from the collection of Lord Dunsany well illustrates the grandeur that O'Keenan lends him in this text. The most impressive of all the Irish lords' public appearances in Rome during the spring of 1608 was the Corpus Christi procession. They were chosen to carry the great baldacchino, or canopy, protecting the Pope and the monstrance. I'll read Paul Walsh's faithful English translation of O'Keenan's account so that you can see how he conjures up the strong public impression that this event made. On the Thursday of Corpus Christi, an order came out from the Holy Father to the princes that 8 of their noblemen should go in person to carry the canopy over the Blessed Sacrament while it was being borne solemnly in the hands of the Pope in procession from the great church of San Pietro in Vaticano to the church of St. James in Borgo Vecchio, and from there back to the church of St. Peter. They came into His Holiness's presence. They carried the canopy over the Blessed Sacrament and the Pope, and never before did Irishmen receive such an honor and privilege. The Italians were greatly surprised that they should be shown such deference and respect. For some of them said that seldom before was any one nation in the world, ein nation Irishmen dawan, appointed to carry the canopy, with the ambassadors of all the Catholic kings and princes of Christendom who happened to be then in the city. It was an established custom that they, in succession every year, carried the canopy in turn. They were jealous, envious, and surprised that they were not allowed to carry it on this particular day. So not only was the carrying of the canopy an honor and privilege for the Irish, but this honor granted them by the Pope was seen by all the Catholic kings and princes of Christendom who were assembled in Rome. In essence, the Irish lords were taking their place in a great public event in which they were being viewed by the other Catholic rulers of Europe, not just as equals, but as worthy of extraordinary honor, and this was an honor usually given to the Italians, who were jealous and envious and surprised at being passed over in favor of these Irish. What created the honor and envy it inspired was the unusual character of the event. This was the first time that the Irish had been honored in this way, and this was the first time that the canopy bearers were selected from one nation in the world. Ein nation awan ishin dawan. Now, this is the first use of the word nation, or nation, in Irish literature. O'Keenan's association of nation, and Aranach, or Irish, together is highly significant, as this is the earliest example of the concept nation in Irish and of the two words in combination. So the word Aranach was coined in this period to include Irish of English descent as well as those of native Gaelic descent. O'Kinnon's choice of nation, or nation, in combination with Aranach marks a new political language and consciousness, forging a national identity that would transcend the ethnic boundaries of Gael and Gaul, or of the Old Irish and the Old English, or the descendants of the 12th century Anglo-Normans. Mind you, they were all Catholic mainly, but they were of different ethnic backgrounds. The creation of this new Irish national consciousness emerges through contact with the Spanish. The many instances of Nashun in O'Kinnon's text occur in context describing special privileges that they were granted to those of the Irish and Spanish nation. There is good reason to think this, since O'Neill and his followers were guests of the Spanish in Rome. O'Kinnon's text appears to have ended up at St. Anthony's College in Louvain, also founded by the King of Spain. In the first 20 years of St. Anthony's, the Franciscans at Louvain founded the first printing press with Gaelic characters and frequently used this word nashun in their works as well. The word nashun, or nation, crops up in their grammars, in manuscript form, military manuals, poems, and saint lives, and theological works. For instance, in E. MacCowell's Scahan Sacramuncha Nahaira, Mirror of the Sacrament of Penance, published in 1618, we find him arguing that, quote, while every other Catholic nation has printed religious books, that they are more necessary in Ireland than elsewhere because of the dearth of priests and preachers. When the Irish lords appear in Rome at the center of Catholic power, in view of all the Catholic kings of Christendom, they achieve for the first time in Irish literature the status of a nation among nations. At any rate, at least from O'Kinnon's perspective, they do. And at this point in the manuscript, the author-scribe congratulates himself. Tig wrote this, and a blessing on his soul. While the narrative of this procession is marked with the wonder and amazement of some 100,000 spectators, half the city of Rome, who turned out to view the Earls, the close of O'Kinnon's story recounts loss and grief. We read of the deaths of O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, in July 1608, of Maguire and his son Seamus in Genoa in August 1608, and O'Neill's son Hugh in September 1609. O'Neill's last years were trying indeed. By autumn of 1614, he had heard news of his attainder and the confiscation of his lands passed by Parliament. He couldn't go back. By July 1615, he was confronted with the executions of those who rose up in rebellion in a failed attempt to force the release of his son Con from the Tower. And meanwhile, despite O'Neill's repeated appeals to the King of Spain to support a military re-entry into Ireland, no commitment was forthcoming. The honor and the ceremony was not fulfilled in the world of realpolitik. Nevertheless, O'Neill's standing within Rome meant that when his kinsmen died, they were commemorated with great honor. And here we see how the deaths of his nephew, Rory O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, and his son, Hugh O'Neill, Baron of Dungannon, were marked with these impressive grave slabs displaying their coats of arms. And you can see the O'Neill Red Hand of Ulster in the grave slab there. The language of these inscriptions shows the preoccupation with this emerging consciousness of nationhood, pro fide et patria cogitante, thinking about his faith and his country. These grave slabs are 2 out of only 3 that remain from the 17th century in the church San Pietro in Montorio. The rest were largely worn away or destroyed by the troops of the Risorgimento, who camped out there in the mid-19th century. Now, some claim that the slabs were saved because the 19th century Italian nationalists recognized the language of the nation in these inscriptions for the young Irish lords, and in sympathy didn't destroy them. And we know, in fact, due to church records, that there were 6 other Irishmen also buried in this church. After the death of Hugh O'Neill in 1615, the next Irishman who would be responsible for bringing hundreds more Irishmen to Rome also lived first at San Pietro in Montorio. He was the Franciscan scholar, diplomat, developer of patronage, and founder of colleges, Luke Wadding. Orphaned at the age of 13, Wadding was brought by his brother to study at the Jesuit college in Lisbon, but he gave up the Jesuits early on and went right over to the Franciscans and entered the monastery at Matozinhos. From there, he went on to study philosophy at Coimbra and at Salamanca. His eloquence at the provincial chapter attracted the patronage of the Vicar General of the Order, Antonio de Trejo, Bishop of Cartagena. In 1618, through the influence of Infanta Margarita, de Trejo was chosen by Philip III to be the ambassador to Paul V, the same Borghese Pope who entertained O'Neill just 10 years earlier. The purpose of Luke Wadding's embassy was to get the Pope to make the Immaculate Conception Church dogma, something that didn't actually happen until 1854. For the King of Spain, belief in the Immaculate Conception or the perfection of Mary, people often misunderstand this. They think it refers to virgin birth. It's really the spiritual perfection of Mary, that she was born without original sin. This constituted a political theological cause for the Spanish, which they believed would ensure unity throughout the kingdom. And in the Americas, the Immaculate Conception became a sign of Spanish imperial power. Although the Pope did not grant the king's wish to make the Immaculate Conception official dogma, Wadding wrote a book on the subject, printed in 1624, and here's the frontispiece of Luke Wadding's account of the embassy to Rome. A year after publishing his work on the Immaculate Conception, Wadding founded Collegio Sant'Isidoro, the College of St. Isidore, which today stands on the Via degli Artisti off the 19th century Via Veneto. And here's the facade of the college. Father Louis encouraged me one day to get out of the library and go see the spring flowers, and I took this photograph of St. Isidore's myself a spring day in April. Wadding was able to take over and renovate St. Isidore's through the network of Spanish and Roman patrons whom he had encountered while working in Rome and living at San Pietro and Montorio. And among his major benefactors were Bishop de Trejo's relative Cardinal Gabriel de Trejo and the Barberini Pope Urban VIII, whose family palace is a short walk from St. Isidore's. Wadding was not only an institution builder, but also a scholar. His publications include, among others, a scholarly edition and commentary on the writings of St. Francis, a treatise on the Hebrew language, an 8-volume history of the Franciscan order, and a 12-volume edition of the works of Duns Scotus. His interest in Scotus stemmed from his concern with the Immaculate Conception of Mary, a doctrine for which Scotus theology was foundational. Citing Anselm of Canterbury, Scotus argued, potuit, decuit, fecit. God could do it, he found it pleasing to do so, so he did make the Immaculate Conception. And here you can see this beautiful painting of the Immaculate Conception flanked by St. Francis and St. Anthony in the Great Hall of St. Isidore's, where the Franciscan students defended their theses. Because of Wadding's prolific output and because of the many students he sent out to teach all over Europe, Father Patrick Tyrrell would, in 1672, commemorate Wadding and all of his students in a magnificent series of frescoes commissioned by Fra Emanuele da Como, an Italian friar. And this group portrait of Luke Wadding, you can see here, and his fellow friars, commemorates their school and their devotion to Mary. And individual portraits of the 17th century Franciscans each express a different attribute of Mary as the Immaculate Conception. So here you can see Luke Wadding calling her illibata, or pure. And these images are visible signs, not only of Wadding's lifelong commitment to the theology of Mary, but also of the entire school of philosophy at St. Isidore's. The concept was central to an incarnational theology in which Mary was chosen by God to be born free from original sin. Now, Wadding also wrote about Ireland. In addition to his 33 printed works, there were also some that never appeared, but which he planned to write. And one of these was a history of Ireland. Now, parts of this Irish history emerge in the history of the Franciscan order, which is filled with accounts of the Irish Franciscans. I mean, it's a history of the entire order from the beginning, from the time of Francis and the first friars, but it has many, many stories about the Irish Franciscans. And the Annales Minorum, the title of the work, record not only the medieval founding of the Irish Franciscan convents, but also more contemporary stories about the trials they suffered during the Reformation when their convents were disestablished. Wadding focuses on their place in the community as protectors of the local religious traditions, as well as of the people who with them suffered attacks from English soldiers during the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland. Wadding's concern for remembering Ireland in Rome led him to put the most ancient, important holy figure in the nation's history, St. Patrick, on the calendar of saints. Many people don't realize this, but before the 17th century, Patrick wasn't on the official Roman calendar, even though he was a very ancient saint, and we have many ancient texts in Old Irish to prove it. On the porch of St. Isidore's, there is a fresco of St. Patrick and one of St. Bridget, and they come replete with Gaelic inscriptions. So there were the Irish in Rome saying, "Here are our saints, they're as old or older than your saints." And the verses from the Irish martyrology of Angus read, "O fire from a perfect son, apostle of Ireland, may the Patrick of many followers be the shelter of our wretchedness." Though Wadding left Ireland at an early age and never returned home, he was devoted to the cause of Ireland. In his nephew Francis Harold's 1662 biography of him, we read, "Luke Wadding was to the Irish scattered throughout Europe what Joseph in Egypt was to the Hebrews. Through the figure of Joseph in Egypt, Harold praises Wadding as an exilic hero of national and religious dimensions." And I quote, "I do not know of any other Irishman outside Ireland who did more good to Irishmen of all kinds, whether in trouble at home or in exile abroad, in the calamities they suffered down to the present, but especially those suffered from the time of the defection of Henry VIII, King of England, for their devotion to the Catholic faith." Now, Wadding's rise from student at the convent of Montesinos in Portugal to guarding in at St. Isidore's in Rome meant that, like Joseph in Egypt, he became a power to be reckoned with. And like Joseph, he used his power to help his compatriots. And perhaps the image that best captures Wadding in his role as both scholar and diplomat is this fresco of him in the Alla Maxima of the Great Hall, painted by Fra Emanuele in 1672. This portrait in fresco of Luke Wadding and those of the other 8 members of the original school are the only portraits of Irish Catholics that exist from the 17th century. Back at home, Irish Catholics did not have the resources to produce this kind of public art. Only portraits of the Protestant ascendancy survive from this period. So the portraits at St. Isidore's, done by a Franciscan friar, were free. They were done as a labor of love by a member of the order. However, the Irish never would have obtained the building or the position of power within the Franciscan order, which gave them access to the services of this artist and the ability to fashion their Catholicism publicly, had they not been in Rome. Father Patrick Tyrrell had these frescoes painted to commemorate the religious, scholarly, and even the political achievements of the Franciscans in Rome, an intention underscored by the repeated mention of the patria, or fatherland, in the biographies of the Franciscans that accompany their portraits. Each portrait comes with a little prose biography. The Alla Maxima at St. Isidore's was the site of diplomatic meetings between the Franciscans and the Cardinal Protector of Ireland. The political dimension of these representations is underscored by the text carved in Roman capitals that accompany them. So under this portrait of the friars in the library, we read, "Never did these walls repeat any unjust word against the Irish, ever abolishing nonsense. If these walls could speak, the stones would preach, just as if now in the heart of the very nation with A blade with the art of drawing itself in immortal characters, praise had been indelibly written, chiseled, and celebrated. The visual portraits of these Irishmen are given the power to speak of the nation. The inscription especially expresses the aspirations of articulating this new national identity formed in exile back to the home country, just as if now in the very heart of the nation. The political influence of Wadding can be seen in his close contact with the powerful Ludovico Ludovisi, the papally appointed protector of Ireland and the nephew of Gregory VIII. When Ludovisi was looking for advice on how to serve Ireland, he sought advice from Luke Wadding. And in 1628, he hoped to found yet another Irish college in Rome, this one named for its patron as the Ludovisian College, now called the Irish Pontifical College. So he founded not only one, but two colleges in Rome. The notion of Wadding in Rome as Joseph in Egypt also suggests that Rome for Wadding was in some sense like Egypt for Joseph, a source of great opportunities for power, and because of that exposure to power, great dangers. Perhaps the first sign that Wadding was subject to the vagaries of power politics in an Egypt like Rome was that he lost control of the Ludovisian College to the Jesuits in 1635, and that was something that really troubled him. The Spanish embassy to the Pope had brought him into a position of power, and that was indeed political as well as cultural and spiritual. Luke Wadding of St. Isidore's became a kind of Irish ambassador in Rome, as Hugh O'Neill had been just 10 years earlier. Wadding was an intermediary between his people and those in power, and he wielded sufficient influence to lobby the Pope to send first the papal agent, Pier Francesco Scarampi, and then the papal nuncio, Giambattista Rinuccini, to Ireland. The Confederates in Ireland, under the leadership of Owen Roe O'Neill, had been fighting for the right to free and open exercise of the Catholic faith in Ireland since 1641. Sending the papal nuncio and 50,000 scudi in aid to the Confederates were sure signs that the Pamphili Pope Innocent X took the Irish Catholic cause seriously. The nuncio, however, was to prove somewhat of a bad fit for the position in Ireland. He was a kind of finicky character. He brought his own bed with him from Italy. He wouldn't sleep in any bed but his own bed. He also didn't speak any Irish or English and was effectively communicating with people in Latin. As a zealous Tridentine Catholic rather than a career diplomat, he had no inclination to compromise or to negotiate. Shortly after November 1645, when Rinuccini arrived in Ireland, the Confederates were faced with the difficult situation of having to decide whether or not to accept peace with the Duke of Ormond, leader of the English King's administration in Ireland. The Old English in the Confederate camp were inclined to accept the peace. Rinuccini weighed in on the matter by excommunicating anyone who accepted the compromise, which did not guarantee the open, but only the tacit acceptance of Catholicism. So this pronouncement of excommunication split the Confederacy in two, and in effect, Rinuccini's excommunication made that new civic national identity envisioned in the words nation, and Aranach, Irish, practically impossible. It also put Luke Wadding in a very difficult situation. He was approached by both sides, both the Old Irish and the Old English, for help. His power in this instance caused him to be the object of envy and resentment. The Old Irish blamed him for siding with the Old English. And we read in the Commentarius Rinuccinianus that Wadding was accused of spying for the Old English faction. There's no evidence to prove this. The problem for Wadding was that he lent an open ear to all sides in an effort to help the entire Irish group of people. So because of these accusations, Wadding was somewhat under a cloud. And we read later in 1678, Peter Walsh, who was somewhat of a chancy character himself, he was a kind of what we could call him a failed Franciscan. He didn't stick with the order, but he tells this dramatic story of how Luke Wadding was publicly denounced by the followers of the papal nuncio Rinuccini in Rome. And He writes, I could further add one memorable instance more of the enraged malice of those hypocritical Irish nunciatus zealots at Rome against even Father Luke Wadding himself. I say, against that very Wadding, who had been for so many years before continually at Rome, and both for his writings and prudence, deemed the most esteemed and honored ecclesiastic of the Irish nation, and that both by cardinals, ambassadors of princes and estates, and by the popes themselves, who had been so long the only chief man who over any other in the affairs of Ireland was considered by them. And good God, that the hoary hairs of so venerable, so great a man should be led to the grave in grief, aspersed even with the blackest of calumnies, which the malice of those ungrateful nunciatus, even of those also, I mean, who had otherwise been educated by himself, bred in his own bosom, and lived by his industry, care and study, and labors could invent. In other words, it was fellow Franciscans who were complaining about him. Walsh's description of Wadding recalls O'Kienan's description of O'Neill. Like O'Neill, Wadding is described in terms of honor. He is the most esteemed and honored and in terms of the nation, the Irish nation. He had won the admiration of ambassadors, of princes and states and popes, just as O'Neill had been admired by all of the Roman dignitaries witnessing the Corpus Christi procession. This honor is signified in the inscription on Wadding's tombstone, Vir erudito virtutibus ornato de ecclesia religione et patria ben merito. Erudite man, adorned with virtue of church, religion, and country, well merited. But if O'Neill and Wadding attempted to place Ireland within the realm of European power politics, for the seminarians at the Irish College who pledged their lives to return to Ireland, their country was still a missionary area, and in that respect, more like territories outside Europe than those within it. You could say that Ireland was a church and a mission, and neither. Just as the Pope sending Rinuccini to Ireland was part of the Counter-Reformation Church's fight against Protestantism in Northern Europe, so too the cultural productions that emerged from St. Isidore's were also part of the larger post-Tridentine struggle. Two texts written by Francis O'Molloy, who taught theology at St. Isidore's from 1658 to 1677, illustrate how, from the vantage point of Rome, Ireland was viewed as an embattled outpost of the Catholic Church. O'Molloy's Irish catechism, called Lucerna Fidelium in Latin and in Irish Lochran na Gréidh, or the Lamplight of Faith, from 1676, and his guide to Irish pronunciation, grammar, and metrics, the Grammatica Latino-Hibernica, both were printed in Rome by the press of the Propaganda Fide. And this was an institution that was sending out catechisms and dictionaries and missionaries all over the world. These works came to the attention of Propaganda Fide through the influence of O'Molloy's powerful allies, Monsignor Baldeschi, secretary of Propaganda Fide, and Cardinal Altieri, nephew of Pope Clement X, and leader of the government in Rome at his time. The printing house of Propaganda Fide, seen at the top of the center of this map from 1697, was at the heart of Rome and a short walk from St. Isidore's. But the press published works to be sent out to missions, as I said, all over the globe. The first printing press published works, the first printing characters donated to Propaganda Fide were those in Glagolithic, used for Old Church Slavonic, and Cyrillic, used for East and South Slavic languages. They also had an alphabet and a grammar for the Ethiopian language, printed in 1630 and 1631. And characters for the Persian alphabet were introduced in 1633, and Arabic fonts were introduced in 1639. So if we look at other examples of languages whose first printed grammars appeared at the press of Propaganda Fide, we find, for example, those in Ethiopian, Georgian, Malayan. So having its first printed grammar printed by Propaganda Fide places Ireland in that same category as other missionary churches in Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East and Asia. If one takes into account that the first printed grammar of Irish comes a good 100 years after the first printed grammar of Nahuatl, 1571 in Mexico, one has a sense of how belatedly the Irish came to printing. Now, this was due largely to their lack of access to printing press under the English administration in Ireland. In other words, they had to go to Europe, they had to go to Louvain, they had to go to Rome in order to get books in their language printed. It wasn't, of course, that the Irish had not produced catechisms and grammars before O'Neill's works went into print. The first Irish printing press specifically set up to publish Catholic theological works as well as histories and philological works was at Louvain. And the Franciscans at Louvain produced the earliest and probably the best catechisms and grammars, but in manuscript, not in printed form. The two most important catechisms produced by the Louvain Franciscans were Bonaventura O'Hussa's Anchagas Chrisaha, the Christian Instruction, printed in Antwerp in 1611, and E. McCowell's Scahan Sacramentum Nahaira, Mirror the Sacrament of Penance, 1618. Whereas the catechisms were printed, however, the grammars were produced in manuscript. Now, while O'Hussa wrote his Rudimenta Grammaticae Hibernicae, the first formal grammar in Irish, between 1607 and 1614, it was not printed until 1968. Why was O'Hussa's grammar allowed to remain in manuscript while O'Molloy's grammar was published in Rome? The stronger concentration of Irish-speaking students was at the Franciscan College at St. Anthony's in Louvain. St. Isidore's and the Ludovisian College tended to attract more Old English students. They didn't have as strong a knowledge of the Irish language. Perhaps this in part accounts for the necessity of a printed pocket-sized grammar that could actually be used by the Roman seminarians when they returned to work in the mission in Ireland. In fact, in the later 17th and early 18th centuries, we find records of Irish seminarians regularly requesting copies of O'Molloy's Irish grammar and the Catechism from Propaganda Fide in order to bring it back with them to Ireland. And the text is more than a grammar. At least half of it is devoted to teaching Irish verse forms. Now you might ask, why? Well, in the process of recounting the verse forms, O'Molloy actually creates a kind of anthology of Irish poetry. And this could have been useful to the Franciscans returning to Ireland because there was a Franciscan tradition of preaching in verse because it was memorable. You know, it had a kind of ring to it, and people liked that. So the seminarians might have been using these verse forms as a way to prepare for their preaching. From 1608, when Hugh O'Neill first arrived in Rome, until 1677, when the first grammar of Irish was printed there, Rome saw a marked increase in the number of Irish on its landscape. In O'Kienon's travel narrative, the Irish Earls make a major public appearance in a religious procession witnessed by half the city. The graves at San Pietro and Montorio stand as a memorial to the Irish Earls' exile from Ireland. And in the negotiations of Luke Wadding, we see the Irish exercising the power to enlist papal patronage for a political cause. All this, which shows the Irish as players, if small ones, in European politics, appears in another light when we consider the risks that the seminarians took when they returned to Ireland to minister to the needs of the people back home. Those seminarians who did return faced a precarious existence. Some lost their lives. To have a nation's first printed grammar appear from Propaganda Fide was in a sense to be culturally outside the map of Europe, in the needy and dangerous state of a mission. In their exile in 17th century Rome, the Irish began to think of themselves as a nation among nations, and even to create institutions that recognized their separate national status. However, since Ireland was still a mission and still suffered the disruption that went along with that, it was still less than a nation. And when we think about the amazing impact that Rome, as a European center of learning, patronage, and papal power had on the self-representation ideology, political action of the 17th century Irish, we might well reflect on the advantages to be gained from such incorporation, as well as the losses. Becoming international and European could also mean losing an older, more local sense of Irishness. The impulse to recuperate this sense of Irishness in exile and to publish it to the Irish community, as well as the larger community in Rome and Europe, motivated O'Molloy's grammar and catechism, as well as Wadding's commemoration of Irish history in the Annales, each a considerable cultural achievement. the more local and more nuanced set of affiliations that were developed in the political alliances between Old English and Irish in 17th century literature and politics were, however, to be virtually obliterated by the interference of the papal representative Rinuccini, whose strict ideology would not countenance such cross-confessional alliances. They would only be resurrected in the civic alliance of the late 18th century United Irishmen and Catholic Defenders. These gains and losses of the 17th century Irish in Rome are worth reflecting on perhaps today, as Ireland, as well as other nations, considers the gains and losses of incorporation into Europe and beyond that into the larger globalized world. Thank you very much. Well, you all probably know that in the period 1168-1172, there was an English conquest of Ireland. It's referred to usually as the Anglo-Norman Conquest. And it was actually sanctioned by the Pope. And the excuse given for it was that the English were going to, the Anglo-Normans were going to reform the church system in Ireland. Of course, it was a land grab on the part of these antsy Anglo-Norman nobles who were, the younger sons were running out of land in England, and they were going to go get some in Ireland. But what happened to these people is after about 200 or 300 years in Ireland, they went native. They became Irish speakers. They intermarried with the Old Irish, and they were all, everybody was Catholic. And even when the Reformation came, many of these Old English people, continued to be Catholic, and they continued to intermarry with the Old Irish, and many of them actually even fought with Hugh O'Neill in the 9 Years' War, and some of them, like Balting, you've heard of the Balting Glass Rebellion of the 16th century, he was a rebel and he was Old English. So you could be of English heritage, but still be Irish. And so the Gaelic words, Gaul means foreigner, and that was the term used for the Old English. And the Gael were the Gaelic, the Old Irish. But in this period, you get a new language. The word Irish, Eranach, is invented to include both groups. And it was really a new concept that everybody could be part of this one Irish group, united. So it has sort of its ups and downs in history. But does that, yeah, it's a confusing thing. Well, there was a lot of correspondence back and forth between the Louvain Franciscans and the Franciscans at St. Isidore's. Luke Wadding wasn't the Irish scholar that the Four Masters were. Micheál O'Clery was the greatest Irish historian of the Franciscans. Wadding, remember, was orphaned at age 13, spent his entire adult life in either Portugal, Spain, or Rome. We do find, I was happy to find in the Annales that there are a lot of Irish words, and he translates them. So I think he did have a rudimentary knowledge of Irish, and I think they tried to keep Irish going, even in Rome. But Rome wasn't the Irish language center that Louvain was. And Micheál O'Clery was the one who had gathered all of those manuscripts and documents from which to write the Annals of the Four Masters. So the Louvain Franciscans had more contact with Ireland and with things Irish and with the language. They were closer. But we should remember Micheál O'Clery, and the Annals of the Annal of Riachta Aran. Well, you see, anybody who was a seminarian, anybody who became either a Franciscan or who went to the Jesuit college, the Ludovisian college, they all took a pledge that they would return to Ireland. And they had to do so during this period in the 17th century. I mean, there are some decades that are better than others, but like 1650 would be like the nadir. I mean, that would be when priests are being killed all over Ireland and people are. It was not always that easy for them to get back into Ireland. The war was raging in the 1640s and 1650s, but they did make it back, and they did minister to the needs of the people in Ireland, those who got back in. Some stayed in Rome and became, professors. One was even the secretary to the Archduke of Tuscany. A lot of them got plummy jobs on the European continent because they had great education and they could manage to stay in Europe. So not all returned, but quite a few did return, and at some risk in this period. But it's interesting to think about these power politics, like when we were reading about the Vatican politics today, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. I mean, there have always been these factions and those who are in and out, and it's good to be, Paul Krugman was saying in the New York Times today, it's good to be skeptical about the stories that you read. Don't always believe a story simply because it's in the New York Times. I think I feel that Luke Wadding was indeed really working hard for the Irish and the Franciscans, and he got caught, in this factional struggle, and this happens still today. You can see it all sorts of evidence of it in our contemporary context. They were more concerned with what they had to lose vis-a-vis getting into a war with the English. So they throughout the 16 teens, and you have talk about possible invasion, but by the 1620s, you've got the King of Spain creating a peace treaty with the English. And so that it was more important to conserve his power and his army and his energy and not go to war with England than to help these poor Irish people. So this still happens today. Smaller groups of people get caught in the crosshairs.